So today we're going to go over natural law's perspective on judicial roles. And in this discussion, we're going to delve into the concept of natural law theory, its implications for judicial roles, and basically work out how natural law fits into a modern sort of integration of societal sort of judicial roles. So it's rooted in classical philosophy. Natural law is a way of providing a unique framework to understand the judicial role. It advocates that judges uphold universal moral principles to achieve justice, not merely by strict adherence to written statutes, but integrating moral reasoning. And this is traditional moral reasoning based on Western values, etc., for the most part. So this approach underscores the responsibility of the judiciary to ensure that laws align with higher moral norms, those held through society. Something, as we've discussed in earlier lectures over the years in natural law, the concepts by Aristotle, the concepts, for instance, by Aquinas, etc. Now, under natural law, the role of a judge is a bit more than just a strict interpretation. It goes into positing that the law is intrinsically connected to universal moral truth. Here, we place judges as custodians, stewards of the truth. Their primary duty is therefore one that extends beyond enforcing man-made laws, but actively safeguarding moral principles held by society, not things that change willy-nilly, but ones over time, striving in a more conservative manner to align the legal provisions with concepts like fairness, equality, and common good. This is how we find many of the areas, such as equity, that have devised sort of alternatives to the common law, how they've really developed. Now, natural law requires judges to act not only as interpreters of the law, but as moral arbiters. They have to be vigilant in recognizing and rectifying injustices within the system as well. So this doesn't really mean that they should be an activist judge. Rather, they should look back to the traditions that have created society, not how we can change these norms into something new, but what have society as a whole built the framework of where we are upon. So to integrate morality and justice in a judicial system, judges are influenced by natural law and natural law theory in a way that allows them to integrate moral reasoning directly into their legal interpretation. Where we have an ambiguous case, the judge is tasked with interpreting statutes in a way that advances equity, justice, and the common good. This approach, while occasionally controversial, ensures that legal outcomes remain both legally sound and morally defensible, providing a legal system that upholds the spirit and the letter of the law. In this, judges need to balance legal positivism and natural law theory. So a judge is bound by the rule of law. Natural law theory allows a degree of interpretive flexibility. It's not as wide as many of the alternatives that we see, but it's enough that where there's something inequitable, it can be addressed. This is where I say the common law can extend into new areas. So in situations where strict adherence to a statutory law may result in an unjust outcome, natural law provides judges with a basis for a judicial decision, flexibility that is crucial for maintaining justice. This especially can be found in cases where the positive laws might conflict with a higher moral standard. So if we look now into some case studies, natural law in action, what we see is many historic landmark human rights cases have exemplified how natural law principles influence judicial decision-making. Here, judges draw upon natural law in cases involving civil liberties to protect core human rights. This even comes when such decisions challenge established legal norms. These cases illustrate how judicial roles really help in defending moral values, contribute to legal and social reform, and incorporate natural law into judicial reasoning. Now, natural law is related to common law, but there are compatibilities and tensions here. So despite the intersection between the common law and natural law and common law traditions can diverge. The common law's reliance on precedent and established customs can clash with natural law and the foundations of moral principles, especially when the concept of moral principles is more flexible. In the past, where religious moral principles were fairly common and, analogous across society, for instance, in England with the Church of England, in America with Christian values, etc., then this was far simpler. But as we've moved into a system where we're integrating multicultural society, judges now navigate complex issues in a way that is carefully balancing respect for precedent with moral integrity, but with a wider variety of what we consider moral integrity. So common law tradition favors judicial restraint. Natural law encourages an active role and actually wants the judge to uphold moral standards. This can sometimes border on judicial activism. In this, what we see is a unique responsibility on judges, compelling them to balance natural law and moral reasoning to achieve justice. This interplay of legal and moral frameworks is something like we see in Adam Smith with his two works, upholding moral values and capitalism, and how they seem to be contradictory, but when you understand both works, can come together. Judges here become enforcers of the law, guardians of higher moral principles, and uphold a legal system rooted in fairness, justice, and integrity. So each of the areas we need to think about, we need to now take and imagine a courtroom, not so much as a sterile hall of bureaucratic obedience, but as what I would say is a living arena where human reason, bound to unyielding commitment to truth and justice, confronts the confines of human-made statutes. Natural law demands of us, as individuals, that we see beyond the mediocrity of mere rules and consider the higher principles which govern human existence itself. Within this framework, natural law framework, the judge becomes not a passive mouthpiece and legislative writ, but a moral agent wielding rationality as a force against tyranny and injustice. And this one is a critical aspect, rational. So natural law, in essence, speaks to the universal and immutable truths about humanity's rightful place in the world, a place of dignity, freedom, and self-sovereignty. It stands above written law and as the stars above streetlights, and insists that any man, and certainly any judge, who encounters laws opposed to these ideals must question the very foundation of those laws. So we will explore further in this how natural law informs the judiciary's higher calling, assigning to judges a duty not simply to interpret statutes, but to integrate justice, fairness, and moral vision into the ruling. A judiciary that yields to natural law understands that there are values greater than the decrees of any governing body. One example would be free speech. Even if a judiciary imposes values that, basically say that free speech should be constrained, natural law teaches a justice that the values that endure beyond the whims of momentary power must be enforced. The judge, therefore, is not a servant to written law, but its master, tasked with discerning alignment or discord between human law and moral law. And in doing so, the judge preserves the integrity of justice itself. So we will see in this that a judge faithful to natural law refuses to be swayed by collective demands or uniformity or bureaucratic obedience. Instead, they rise to the challenge of wielding judgment with the courage to defend individual rights against the encroachment of arbitrary authority. So what I want you to think about is judicial thought illustrates how individualism and moral integrity can and must be upheld in every decision, every ruling, and every pursuit of justice. So the moral duty of judges follows. To understand the foundation of natural law is to grasp that law at its most fundamental is not crafted purely by human hands, but is discerned through the very nature of existence itself. It is a law not bending to the shifting tides of a collective will or legislative compromise. Instead, it is moral truth, unchangeable and universal. It affirms the sovereignty of the individual and primacy of reason, and natural law stands above any written statute or man-made decree because it is sourced from principles that govern reality, principles accessible to those who will look unflinchably at truth and choose to see. So if you remember when we talked about Montesquieu, when we talked about balancing government, it isn't just mob rule, it isn't pure democracy. In this type of republican system, we see a light of a role of the judge that is more than simply interpreting what legislatures have written, a judge with a duty to uphold timeless principles against dangers of relativism and tyranny, a judge whose role is to serve as a bulwark against the laws that violate the very inherent rights of the individual, and see each case not merely as a matter of legality, but as a matter of moral justice. For every judge who truly understands the nature of this calling, there lies what is, I would say, a profound duty to ensure that their rulings reflect not just the letter of the law, but its alignment or alternatively misalignment with higher morals or truths. Judges under natural law are expected to embrace a standard of courage, integrity, one that goes far beyond technical adherence to written rules. They are called to measure its statute against the principles of reason, justice, and individual rights. If a law deviates from those standards, then it is not a law in the true sense. It becomes an affront to the dignity of man. As such, a judge's fidelity to natural law is not passive. It is not a passive act, but a defensive action, a declaration that the individual must never be sacrificed at the altar of collective conformity or government overreach. So judges are in this system guardians of moral standards that transcend written codes. To interpret law without reference to such a higher standard is to abandon justice for procedure, to become a functionary rather than a thinker, to eschew rationality. It is to betray the responsibility given to one who holds the gavel. Natural law holds that each man, and certainly each judge, has a moral duty to reject any law that would trample upon individual freedom or dignity. For a judge's ultimate loyalty must be to truth, not the whims of power or precedent. Hence, why we have separate houses, separate areas. Why, as we described, we have a separation of powers. In the framework of natural law, the judge's role is elevated almost to what could be called a heroic stature, one who must, against all pressures of the world, uphold justice by aligning with the man-made and the immutable in such a way that through natural law, the judiciary is reminded that real justice is uncompromising, that it recognizes no authority but that which upholds the truth of man's rights, his liberty, and his sovereignty. This, then, is the moral duty of every judge, to ensure that their judgments are not merely lawful, but in the fuller sense, are just. So, natural law elevates the role of a judge far beyond that of a mechanistic application of statutes and bureaucratic directives. Under natural law, a judge is not a passive executor or executor of written codes, but a custodian of justice, a steward. They are a steward standing against societal pressure, any societal pressure that would reduce law to a mere tool of control. The judge's mandate, therefore, is to safeguard justice itself, to act as a rational force capable of discerning the difference between what is lawful and what is right, and here choosing what is just and right. This distinction can be blurred in the machinery of modern legal systems and becomes, well, something that is critical when we see laws. It becomes technically legitimate to infringe upon fundamental human rights, well, freedom, dignity, etc. And the judge is thus a true custodian of justice, one who must rise against the constraints and recognize that statutes alone don't define justice. The written law is a guidepost, a reflection. It can be flawed. It is a guidepost of society's attempt to formalize moral standards and more. But when a statute departs from these standards, when it becomes a vehicle of oppression and not protection, when it goes beyond rights, beyond our duties, beyond what makes us something, into a Rawlsian idea of extending everything to have government act to protect whether we want it or not, then when those statutes depart those standards, they become a vehicle of oppression rather than protection. The judge has a duty grounded in natural law to confront this. To serve justice, a judge must be prepared to question any rule that undermines an individual's right to self-determination. This commitment isn't simple or convenient, and that's why it's heroic. It is the essence of a fair natural law judge's role. Through natural law, the judge's purpose is to strip away the veil of procedural formality and reveal whether the statute respects the core principles of justice or not. Laws created by governments are temporary constructs here, vehicles that are vulnerable to the errors of the moment, susceptible to the whims of those in power. A judge devoted to justice recognizes this vulnerability and seeks always to interpret laws in light of unchanging moral standards. They must remain unyielding and refuse to subjugate reason and principle to authority and convention. So in this sense, a judge becomes the steward not only of the written law, but the very ideals that make law worthy of obedience. Each case encountered demands an active inquiry. Does this law respect the sovereignty of the individual? Does the law honor the integrity of human rights? Does it uphold the highest moral ideals of the society that we claim to have value of freedom and justice? So a judge can ask these questions and act upon the answers. And if they can come back correctly, then we find a judge who has grasped their role under natural law, not as servants of statutes, but guardians of justice itself. Beyond bureaucratic constraints, beyond the pressures of expedience or public approval, we find the judge whose highest calling is to maintain an unwavering fidelity to justice. This task requires moral courage, intellectual honesty, and uncompromising commitment to truth. For here, we find a judge is, in the truest sense, a protector of humanity's most fundamental rights, a role that, in the hands of those guided by natural law, transformed the courtroom into a sanctuary of justice, a place where the individual is at last sovereign. This is why I said it's heroic. It's also something that's not common. Here, the primacy of the individual and the individual rights concept that we've talked about many times is foundational in the role of moral reasoning. We find at the heart of natural law, we find what lies there is the assertion that the individual and the individual's rights are paramount. These stand above the edicts of any institution or collective authority. These rights are not granted by governments or majorities. They are inherent to each person by virtue of their humanity. Here, a judge who embodies the principles of natural law must view each case through, well, the lens of the individual, ensuring that the rights of one are never sacrificed to the whims or demands of the many. This focus on the individual over the collective is not a matter of convenience or legal custom, but a moral imperative, respecting the autonomy and dignity of each human being. So to fulfill this imperative, judges must integrate moral reason into their judgments. Legal positivism, the idea that law is simply because it has been enacted, falls short under natural law. Legality alone does not guarantee justice. We've seen this many times. In the, well, 30s, going into the 40s, in Germany, through Europe, we had a legitimate government. Hitler, the Nazis, the fascists in many countries were voted in. They were legitimate, but that doesn't make the law right. So here, a law that tramples the individual rights, no matter how well crafted or widely accepted, fails the test of moral validity. As such, moral reasoning is indispensable in the judicial process. It allows judges to distinguish between what is merely permissible and what is truly just. It's a reasoning of not being subjective or arbitrary, but grounded in objective principles that recognize the sanctity of the human individual as a sovereign entity. And this also is one of the areas that differ from activism. It is not subjective. Judges are tasked with an unyielding responsibility to ensure that every decision upholds the fundamental individual human rights and that every interpretation of the law respects the individual worth of an individual person. So when faced with laws that seem on their surface neutral or benign, but result in outcomes that strip individuals of their freedoms or subject them to unjust treatment, the judge's duty is to question, to probe, and to act as a protector of those rights. This is the role of moral reasoning in natural law. It serves as a judge's compass, guiding each decision towards justice, even in the face of overwhelming pressure to conform to lesser standards. To bring something that's just happened in the US, we have what has become, in a rather silly way, Peanut Gate. We have the situation where someone in New York has been raided and their squirrel has been taken. I know that sounds a bit silly, but this person had a squirrel and the state came and took it away. And what did they do? They had it put down. Is the squirrel better off? No. Is the person better off? No. Isn't this overreach? I would argue it is. So the primacy of individual rights demand a judiciary that refuses to see individuals as mere elements within a larger collective. Each person is an end to themselves. Very Kantian idea, I'm not. But there are still some aspects of nearly every philosopher that actually work out quite well. And I agree, each person has to be an end in themselves, observing of legal, well, systems that honor their autonomy and respect their choices. So the judge here doesn't simply apply laws, but examines them rigorously, ensuring they meet the highest standards of moral integrity and accountability at all points. Operating under natural law, we find the judge bound by an unwavering commitment to protect the individual against their encroachment of power and to see each case as an opportunity to reaffirm the centrality of human dignity. In this role, moral reasoning becomes not only a judicial tool, but a moral responsibility. The judge becomes an advocate for individual rights, not just applying statutes, but looking at what the actual cost of doing or not doing would be, interpreting and, when necessary, challenging the statutes to safeguard the rights of the individual. Under natural law, every judgment rendered is a declaration that the individual stands supreme. The individual is not subject of the state, not a servant of the collective, but a sovereign being whose rights demand respect and protection. That's the heart of natural law. So to balance natural law and positive law, we find a conundrum of legal authority. And here in jurisprudence, judges faced, well, what we'd find is a persistent challenge of balancing positive law, the codified laws enacted by human authorities, with the immutable principles of natural, well, justice. Positive law is born of governance of power. It's shaped by legislative processes and social demands. It's a system of rules constructed by human hands and subject to human error. Natural law, however, stands on the universal standard rooted in reason and moral truth. When two such forces clash, a judge must decide where their allegiance lies: the transient constructs of society or the timeless dictates of justice. And this is something at the extreme that we can easily see leads to abhorrent conditions if it's not followed. While I'm taking the extreme, if we looked at Pol Pot, if we look at Mao, if we look at Stalin, if we look at Hitler, if we look at any of these scenarios, these are all a failure of justices, of judges, to act for the moral integrity of what stands above a transitory law. Natural law provides judges with a framework for exercising discretion, one affirming their role as moral agents within a system that might otherwise reduce them to a bureaucratic instrument. And when a statute demands an outcome that natural law deems unjust, when it would result in the suppression of rights or the distortion of justice, a judge acting in accord with natural law has not only the right but the duty to deviate from positive law. This isn't judicial activism. Some may claim that, but it's not. It's judicial integrity, a refusal to place expedience or difference above the sanctity of justice itself. Judges then must strike a balance. It's a delicate balance. They must honor the rule of law while recognizing that no law is valid if it violates the rights and dignity of the individual. It's a balance that isn't passive. It's a balance that is active, ongoing, an engagement with each case, each statute, each outcome. Positive law provides structure and consistency, but it is natural law that imbues the legal system with humanity. It is that which ensures that every judgment reflects not only what is legally permissible, but what is morally right. This conundrum of legal authority is not then merely a question of whether to follow the law, but of which law to follow. Judges who serve the ideals of natural law understand that their highest allegiance is to justice, that every ruling is a reaffirmation of the principles that make the law worthy of respect, that make people need to be part of the system. It is by balancing positive law with natural law that they preserve the integrity of the judiciary as a guardian of rights, a steward and protector of human dignity, refusing to let legal authority stand unchallenged when it conflicts with the eternal truths that govern human existence. Here, of course, we must also now think individualism against conformity. How does that really come into a judicial decision? So to examine how natural law influences judicial decisions, we find that it reveals a stark contrast between the championing of individual rights and the demands of societal conformity. Throughout history, certain cases stand as testaments to the courage of judges who, guided by natural law, have chosen to defend the individual against the weight of collected norms or unjust statutes. These are cases that demonstrate the judiciary's power to uphold sovereignty of the individual, even when doing so can require a direct challenge to prevailing legal standards or popular sentiments. One finds in such decisions the echoes of natural law's unwavering insistence that each person is an end in themselves, not a mere component of society's machinery. But where we have these cases, ones involving issues such as freedom of speech, personal autonomy, human rights, judges who have adopted a natural law perspective must confront pressures to adhere to the status quo. They confront pressures to enforce laws that align with societal conformity, the mob, rather than justice. They look at the short term. They look at what the mob comes up with as right. Yet the best of these judgments stands as a tribute to a higher ideal, a recognition that the value of the individual cannot ever be validly sacrificed for convenience or compliance. So when we consider the landmark human rights cases where judges have invoked natural law to uphold liberties that statutory law has denied, such cases reveal an inherent tension between individualism and conformity. The individual and the group. A judge operating under natural law is compelled to act as the steward and protector of the individual, resisting laws that dehumanize or reduce a person to a mere statistic within the collective. This is not just a romantic ideal. It is a fundamental commitment to the principles of justice. It requires justices to interpret statutes in a way that continues to honor human dignity. These cases are ones that show the profound impact of natural law on judicial activism. When a judge decides that certain precedents or legal norms conflict with fundamental moral principles, they must sometimes overturn or even reinterpret established rulings. In doing so, they not only act out of a desire to impose personal beliefs from a duty to realign the law with the universal standards of justice, but uphold justice. It's not something that makes that justice a radical. It makes them faithful stewards of a system that recognizes the individual as supreme. A justice in this system, a justice following natural law, maintains a decision that is not only a legal determination, but a moral pronouncement. It is one that safeguards the integrity of the law, ensuring that it reflects the true worth of the individual. In these examples, natural law theory is really one that stands revealing something that safeguards, well, against force. It is something that challenges a justice to reflect conformity when it contradicts justice. Individualism becomes not just a legal principle, but a moral stance. It is one that compels a judge to protect the rights of a person above the preferences of the collective. It is one that means people protect property, protect rights. It is one that stops the collectivist ideas that society should be ahead of the individual, that we must conform to the will of the mass. These cases are ones that underscore a critical role of natural law and judicial reasoning, proving that a judge's ultimate loyalty isn't to whoever's in power, but one where the ultimate loyalty is to justice. And justice is an expression of individual dignity, not the machinery of conformity. So this is why I've said common law is, well, in effect, an uneasy partnership with natural law. When we look at a relationship between common law and natural law, we find one of both harmony and friction. Common law, as we've covered, is rooted in judicial precedent, rooted in custom. It provides a stable, adaptable framework that evolves through reasoned judgments and societal values. Natural law, on the other hand, asserts immutable moral truths, principles that do not shift with time or cultural changes. When these two frameworks intersect, judges must balance and, well, find an uneasy partnership, one where they must find a balance between the demands of precedent and the uncompromising ideals of natural law. Common law and natural law share a fundamental goal. This is to uphold justice and fairness. The common law's reliance on precedents allows for consistency and predictability, and it ensures that legal decisions are not arbitrary. However, without a moral compass, a compass provided by natural law, common law risks becoming a mechanical system detached from higher principles, something detached from the reason behind why law has a purpose. Natural law steps in to provide these principles. It is the way that offers the judges a moral foundation which to measure existing precedent, and thus common law can align with natural law, creating not only stability, but moral legitimacy. It can ground itself in truths, ones that transcend societal change or the whims of the moment. So tensions arise, of course, when common law precedents conflict with natural law principles. A judge committed to natural law faces that dilemma. Do they uphold a precedent that defies moral reason or challenge it? Do they risk accusations of judicial overreach? This is where the delicate balance that I talked about between constraint, restraint, moral duty, where it all comes to a head and where it's tested. The common law structure of adherence to past rulings often clashes with the judge's responsibility to uphold individual rights and justice. This can be especially true when past rulings reflect outdated societal values or flawed moral judgments. And just because something has happened in the past doesn't mean it's happened because of a flawed judgment. So if we consider now the principle of stare decisis, the principle that we covered earlier, the doctrine that judges should respect established precedent, while this principle underpins the common law's stability, it can also seemingly trap judges in a cycle of conformity. It could seem to force them to uphold decisions that no longer serve justice. Natural law offers a path to liberation, a path to freedom. It permits judges to interpret and then overturn precedents that violate moral truths. So by invoking a natural law, a judge can look beyond the rigidity of precedent and align with natural law in a way that aligns with the universal moral standards, safeguards justice against the inertia of the past, for instance. It is, of course, an uneasy partnership, as I did say at the beginning here. It prompts judges to reflect on their role within the legal system. They must question themselves. They must ask themselves, are they servants of tradition, bound to replicate decisions of the past? Or are they, as natural law would assert, moral agents entrusted with the duty to ensure that every judgment reflects both the letter and the spirit of justice? For a judge under natural law, the answer is clear, of course. While common law provides structure, natural law imparts purpose. Natural law insists that the role of the judiciary is not passively to perpetrate precedent, but to actively embody the principles of justice and truth. So ultimately, the interplay between the common law and natural law exemplifies the complex duty held by the judges. They must respect legal continuity while refusing to surrender justice to the confines of precedent. In this balancing act, judges find what we would see as an uneasy partnership. It's this sort of dichotomy between these two systems that we find a challenge and opportunity, one that will allow us to elevate common law beyond its procedural roots and root it in the enduring principles of natural law that affirm the primacy of the individual and the integrity of justice. So when we're looking at this, we need to consider that the role of a judge, the role of a justice, isn't just to do what has been said before. It isn't just to take the arbitrary whims of the mob, the collective, but rather to look at why something is done. Is it just or not? So I want you to think back. We covered Montesquieu, we covered other authors who talked about the balancing of different societies. We have democracy or the mob, depending on the negative or positive side of it in Plato's Republic. They are balanced, of course, with the aristocratic, the oligarchical, depending on which form we have. And they are balanced with the executive, the monarch, the tyrant. And in this, the glue that hopefully holds it together and gives it purpose is our common law justice. Not one who is an activist, not one who exceeds the bounds of what is right and wrong, not one who seeks to impose their own subjective views, one who looks back into what has made society and the individual, not because they like an individual, but because it's right. The rights of the individuals are sacrosanct in this system. And that's something that many people don't like. So what I would like you now to think about is, how does that differ in what we see in society today? Who wants to take that question?
Okay. Yeah, I'll jump in. I think we look at today, my thoughts when I think about it, if we look at today and throughout history, it's probably not much different today than throughout time, but to me, like natural law, and truth, objective truth versus versus like subjective. Like the question is, how do you know? And you have to do in my opinion, an epistemological analysis of what is true and what isn't. And you have to test your posit that you base it on and your reasoning, you know, for your just whether a law is just or not depends on your justification. Is the reasoning behind your justification true based in, posits uh a premise that is in accordance with the laws of nature, the laws of God. And I think when, what we call activists today, or, you know, people find subjective truth, it's not based, their reasoning's wrong, their justification's wrong. They think they know what's best, and they don't do a good analysis. And I also think that's where the corruption comes in. And I think people start to misconstrue words, misconstrue meaning, and they do things that, aren't in accordance with natural law. So the hard question for me is, how do you know what is objective truth and what is protecting it? But I think just people looking, once they get corrupted and they do they think is in their own short-term interests, is what the problem is. And then they get power. And I think that's a consistent cycle throughout history, and it's very obvious today that people just aren't acting in accordance with what is natural law, and they don't do a good analysis of it.
I completely agree. And the role of a judge is fundamentally tied to upholding objective law, as we said. It's to ensure justice through rational and principled evaluation of facts and evidence. Now, in this, rational and principled evaluation means that, well, judges must act as impartial guardians of individual rights. They must apply laws consistently without personal bias or subjective influence. So here, a judge's role is to interpret and enforce laws based on reason, not emotion, not personal belief. And reason here must go into all of the reasons, and it must be open, and it must be well done, so we ensure that decisions are grounded in objective reality and reflect a rational principle undermining, well, what is a free society. So what we need to do is proper argumentation, proper posits, proper, well, derivation of how we came up with the law. And in this, a judge is entrusted with the task of protecting the individual freedom in adjudicating a dispute and enforcing contract, which are essential to the maintenance of a system where contracts and individuals can be exchanged and individuals can freely interact. Here, a judge must apply the law in a manner that respects the rights of the individual in a way that ensures that each person is treated fairly under the same standards. So that doesn't mean succumbing to power. It means treating each in the same way, equally. Not equal by, well, having the same amount of money or anything like this, but from the same point of view of position. It's an emphasis on objectable principle interpretation, one that aligns with a society governed by objective law that, well, removes or protects at least against coercion and enables rational individuals to flourish. So the question now is, what is the rational? And we have covered this many times before. It's a structured, well, argument that is not full of logical errors. It's not full of fallacies. It's not one that, well, basically bends to the whims of individuals. It doesn't even need to be popular. Sometimes it isn't. It's one that aims to find truth. So
Can I throw out? Can
Yeah.
I make one more comment and ask one more quick question?
Yes.
Just the comment is for Dr. Wright. I think it was a few months ago. I like your poems, and one of my favorites is your Jabberwocky with Spinoza, because it's on the truth and it's on this, and it was reading Spinoza is why and his ideas on truth, and he's the one who got me thinking about like epistemological analysis, and it's probably why he's
Mm.
my favorite philosopher is on this topic of how do you know what is truth, and then just the poem was not only being my favorite topic, it was just good. So thanks for that. But my question too is how does, he says, well, Spinoza say, well, we need to refine a way to ensure our intellect and that we have good reason. What if a judge is put in that position of power? We know power corrupts. How does one protect their intellect from being corrupted when they get put in these positions and they have all these influences and all these pressures on them from that the world? How does one protect themselves from being corrupted?
The hardest part is how do you protect yourself at the highest level? Even in the judiciary, there are levels. And there are many aspects to how this works. Beyond appeal, there are even judicial reviews. And part of what we need to do is start teaching people about society more. When I was young, we had civics lessons, but I don't think they really seem to exist in classes anymore. People complain that we're not teaching people enough math or enough skills or enough XYZ. But right now, we're not teaching people how to live in society. We don't teach them what they can and can't do with their own rights. And we don't teach them to stand up and, well, fight for them. So that's part of this, but that's not the role of the judge. But a judge who knows that there is judicial review, a judge who knows that people are watching, is more likely to back down when confronted with their own abuse of power. And to do that, we need transparency. Unfortunately, even today, most judicial systems are far from transparent. The idea of transparency seems to be something that scares most judiciaries. If we think about it, the majority of pieces of evidence, not just things that are private, but things that are public evidence, are never seen. And that should be changed. It should be something that is open for everyone to view. I would actually recommend, and I've changed over the years on this one, I would recommend that we have completely transparent systems. Government, courts, the whole works. If we want really to know what's happening, then everything should be out in the open. Anonymity in any form breeds corruption.
One thing I was gonna say, well, it's interesting how you had the balance between capitalism and morality. And I think in, today's world, money can kind of control a lot of morality and it gets overridden. And so then in the same way, when you're saying balancing, sort of the precedent and the mob sort of opinions with natural law, I feel like it's a similar thing. And especially in the cases that are really kind of, you know, uh, hyped and followed a lot, it can be difficult for the judge to actually um, follow what might be rational and obey natural law, but is unpopular by the mob because he may fear for his own safety or, just he doesn't want to be an unpopular judge with his society. Wonder what you might think about that.
This is why I said it's the judge who must be heroic. It is the person who must stand against the, well, proverbial slings and arrows. It's a person who must stand steady against, well, adversity. And that's why I mentioned the natural law judge must be heroic. It's easy, and I'll say easy, to be an activist judge. You go out there and you do what's popular at the time. It's the exact opposite of all of this. It's easy to be a pure positive law judge. You can sit there and go, it's not my fault. The statutes are there. Don't blame me. it's hard to be a natural law judge because you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's against the popular opinion at the time. And the popular opinion is often not right. We see that all through society, all through history. We saw it 100 years ago, even in England. Chamberlain basically wanted to appease Hitler. He said, we don't want to go to war. Why don't we just allow things to happen? And what happened? It escalated. And sometimes you've got to actually take a stand. So again, it comes back to, do we train people to fight for moral rights? Your founding fathers, they stood up and they risked their lives, not when they were old men, when they were young. Young radicals, most in their 20s, went and fought for a new nation. And they did it. Why? Because they thought it was right. Some bits were, some bits weren't. And no, they weren't perfect. They allowed slavery rather than break the Union. And that later caused problems. But at the edge of this, we still find that, well, they fought for something better. And it may not have been perfect, and it will never be perfect. But this is what we're seeking. We're seeking people who will have the moral integrity for what their beliefs are, no matter what the cost.
Yeah, I'll keep asking questions until you cut me off. But I'll bring it back to Bitcoin too a little bit. I think last class I asked, is the white paper a posit? And any system, a societal construct, we want to use it. But also a couple of years ago, it goes around a lot. I wrote an essay, titled "Was Bitcoin Divinely Inspired?" And then I go into it. I don't know if I quote you, Dr. Wright, from one of your theory of Bitcoin saying, I'm an applied mathematician and applied scientist. I don't go out there and try to invent new things. I go out and say, hey, nature is doing this really well. I'll just take that and I'll reapply it over here. So then my argument is based on another Spinoza argument saying, hey, he says that, the universal laws of nature, according to which all things exist and are determined, are only another name for the eternal decrees of God. So I feel like if you go out and you see what nature is and you see the truth and the natural laws of nature, and then you write a paper to posit applying a system that is based in natural law, then it's essentially Bitcoin is the way a legal system should be done as well, based on natural law, things that are true, game theory and small world networks and all these things you see to be truths, and then you posit a system based on that. I guess just your thoughts on that. Is Bitcoin in that way, again, similar to as a system, a legal system that we can use, but based in truths? And then one more question too, since I said was Bitcoin divinely inspired? The more I think about it, I guess my question is there any other source of inspiration than the divine?
Well, my answer will be that I believe everything's divinely inspired in some way. So that will answer the other question. So if everything has some form of divine inspiration, then the question sort of ends. But whether we interpret things correctly is another aspect of this. And unfortunately, us humans are flawed, and no matter how good the inspiration, we get it wrong. So that doesn't mean Bitcoin's wrong, but it does mean that people will interpret things wrong. All right, at this point, I need to actually disappear, but I will answer further questions on Twitter and things like this. And I hope that this was insightful.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, everyone.
Till
Thank you.
next
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Right, everyone, I shall be ending the recording now, and shortly afterwards I will end Twitter Space. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We have one more chapter, chapter 8 next month. I will try and give proper warning on Twitter next time. I meant to this time, so apologies to everyone that Twitter appeared suddenly. So yeah, we have chapter 8 and the conclusion, which I'm currently debating whether we do the conclusion at the same time as chapter 8. Depends how much time we get in December, because it might be a busy month for Craig. So, but it will at minimum be chapter 8. If we don't do the conclusion, we will do the conclusion in January. And then I plan to have one more month afterwards, which will be a summary of the whole philosophy class of philosophy of law, just that part. And then next year we will be doing something new and interesting, which we're keeping a surprise for now. Okay, thank you everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.